My guest today is Professor Ernest Chi Fru, who's Associate Professor of BioGeoChemistry at Cardiff University. He focuses on how life influences the cycling of elements like iron, sulfur, arsenic, phosphorus, copper, zinc, and carbon through the geobiosphere, and how these processes have shaped Earth's atmosphere and environment over geological time. Welcome, Ernest.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I got a couple of your papers that seem very, very interesting. So I want to start with hydrothermal seawater eutrophication triggered local macrobiological experimentation. You say here it is thought that the global predominance of small-sized unicellular prokaryotic life in the oceans until the emergence of large-sized multicellular organisms to ecological dominance in the Ediacaran Ocean after 635 million years ago was partly constrained by paleodynamic nutrient limitation, with phosphorus being the principal limiting resource. So, so I want to understand this a little bit technically, Ernest. So, first of all, could we sort of lay out the timeline a little bit? So, I know that the Earth is, I don't know, 4.5 billion years old. Um, my understanding is that the single cell organisms might have showed up just maybe 4 billion years ago, so only half a billion years later. But then we had to wait for a long time for the multicellular organisms to appear, it seems like. And so that is sort of the general timeline. But I want to understand, why is phosphorus so important for building life?
Right. So that's really the core of the issue, isn't it? Phosphorus. Phosphorus is central to everything that's living. So if you think of it, the DNA in our bodies, that's the molecule that carries all the genetic information that produces all the biomolecules, the proteins, the enzymes, everything.
Mm,
The DNA, the backbone of the DNA is made of phosphorus, right?
mm,
Now, if you think of the fact that I'm talking to you now, that we're having this exchange and I'm able to move my hands and smile, all of that is because there's a molecule in my body called adenosine triphosphate. So it's got phosphorus in it.
mm.
That is the energy currency of the cell.
That's
So
ATP. Is it ATP?
ATP,
ATP.
adenosine triphosphate. So it has phosphorus in it. Now, think about, you know, RNA. RNA's got phosphorus in it. The cells in my body, the membrane that bounds, that keeps everything within it, that membrane is made up of phospholipids. So it contains phosphorus. So without phosphorus, you wouldn't have a cell membrane.
Mm,
You wouldn't have DNA. You wouldn't have RNA. You wouldn't have, the biomolecules that actually drive everything. And this is not something that it's limited to one life form. It's
mm,
common across the tree of life. So over geological time, the amount of phosphorus that has been available to life has actually constrained
mm,
the evolution of life quite significantly. And we see this from the very early Earth when there was no oxygen to
mm,
when we start to see oxygen. We can the rise in oxygen is kind of really correlated to the increase of phosphorus in the oceans, because the cyanobacteria that produce the oxygen, the population had to grow and all of that, and phosphorus was a very, very important nutrient.
So I know that carbon, is able to form long chains, and that is why it is sort of the foundational part of our kind of life. But from a chemical perspective, what makes phosphorus unique in all these things, DNA, cell membrane, and so on?
Right. So you have to look at it from the sort of structures that they form in the body. First of all, phosphorus, it's able to form bonds that are actually quite difficult to break, but at the same time, you can quickly hydrolyze them, so break them.
Mm-hmm.
They form very, very stable bonds. And that's why, for example, phosphorus in ATP, you have three phosphorus atoms that are connected tail to tail.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a splitting of one of the phosphorus, the bond between two phosphorus atoms that releases energy.
Mm-hmm.
And when you want to conserve energy, you basically add a phosphorus to another to the two phosphorus atoms that are already existing in inosine diphosphate. So A DP instead of ATP. And when you add that phosphorus, you now have three phosphorus atoms, and that is called adenosine triphosphate, and that preserves the energy. And so when you break and form that bond, you
Mm-hmm.
produce or you conserve and you release energy.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
It's like
if
a
you think
switch.
it's like a switch, basically, it's an energy switch. And when life is active, basically,
Mm-hmm.
life is busy breaking adenosine triphosphate, the phosphorus bond in the adenosine or ATP, releasing energy.
Mm-hmm.
And when we eat, we conserve that energy by attaching a new phosphorus bond to adenosine diphosphate. And that's just the process. And if you think of the cell membrane, right?
Yeah.
The cell membrane, it's very simple. It's basically made of something we call a polar head,
Mm-hmm.
meaning um, it has the ability to attract water and a hydrophobic head that basically repels water. So what you get is that arrangement, the tail of, so you have this structure and there's a tail, and that tail is made of uh, phosphorus. And because phosphorus is kind of charged,
Mm-hmm.
it in a way creates this movement of things into the cell based on the whether it's hydrophobic or it repels water or it attracts water. So the organization of the cell membrane is actually just organized around the ability to repel or attract water. And if you attract things, they get into the cell, but the membrane has to control what is getting in there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the selective pressure appears. So phosphorus, the way it's used is dependent on exactly what sort of process that you want to use it for.
Yeah.
And the main thing is that it forms stable bonds that are at the same time easy to break
Mm-hmm.
and to form, and that process just happens all over and over again.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it's like life's battery. Yeah, in the ATP context, it is truly a battery. In the cell membrane context, it is sort of charging up some parts of some parts of the cell. So there is a lot of effort going on trying to find extraterrestrial life, Ernest. So I don't know if you do research on this. So if we are looking for our kind of life, um, then looking for phosphorus could be a profitable way, right? I mean, there's a lot of excitement about Europa and acidulas. And so phosphorus concentrations in those moons could be a good indication if there's something underneath the surface, maybe.
Yeah, so actually, the reason why I'm sitting in this hotel room is because I'm here in Scotland to give two lectures on this is an astrobiology, a European Association of Astrobiology summer course, field course, and this are the things we're talking about. So, if you want to look for life in extraterrestrial body, assuming that you're looking for the kind of carbon-based
Yeah,
life
yeah.
as we have on Earth, then obviously phosphorus is going to be very important. How much is there? In what form is that phosphorus? Because sometimes you might have phosphorus, and say if that phosphorus is bound, for example, to iron oxide, so just iron it's in an oxidized form, it has a very high affinity for phosphate. And if that phosphorus or phosphate is bound to iron, it's not available. Now, so you can have a lot of phosphorus in the environment, but the question is it bioavailable?
Mm.
So yes, so when we're looking for, to characterize planetary bodies for possible um, Earth-like life, you would want to think of phosphorus as very important. And if you
Mm.
see a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, and you want to think that the oxygen is produced by cyanobacteria, as we know on Earth, then that cyanobacteria is going to need a lot of phosphorus to actually photosynthesize and release oxygen into that atmosphere.
Are there alternatives to phosphorus, arsenic or something like that, that could potentially step in?
Well, that's a really big one there because a few years ago there was this controversy where some researchers isolated a bacterium from a soda lake in California
Yeah.
and tried to characterize it, and somehow ended up with a conclusion that this organism is using arsenate instead
Mm.
of phosphate in its DNA because arsenate it looks a lot like phosphorus or phosphate. It behaves a lot like phosphate. Its size is almost the same as that of phosphate, so it can fit and react in spaces where phosphate would actually occupy. And you would think that arsenate would be a good candidate to actually replace phosphate in, say, DNA. But the problem with arsenate is that it hasn't got the stability that
Mm.
phosphorus or phosphate is called a phosphorus when it's included in biomolecules. It breaks down really quickly, and in that way, arsenic is actually toxic for the cell because if you replace all your DNA with arsenic, that DNA is going to degrade really quickly,
Mm.
and all the other biomolecules that are formed using arsenic or arsenate specifically, those
Mm.
biomolecules are going to be very unstable.
So you say in the paper, here we couple an episode of intense submarine hydrothermal alteration of a nutrient-rich seafloor reservoir. Um, and is the hypothesis here that hydrothermal vents in the seafloor actually produced phosphorus, large quantities?
Right. Yeah. Maybe I should give a background to this.
Yeah.
In 2010, some colleagues of mine were in Franceville in Gabon in Central Africa, and they came across this geological formation where they found some structures in it that looked like life.
Hmm.
And this geological formation is about 2.1 billion years old. And these life forms are really big. We know that we've not seen anything around that period
Hmm.
in Earth history. And they worked on this and published a paper in Nature saying that they found complex life at this point in time, and this created a lot of controversy and debates because the largest thing we've seen that it's reminiscent or looks like complex life, it's in the Ediacaran. Now we're talking about moving this time about 1.5 billion years
Yeah.
deep
And
into,
Ediacaran is like 635 million.
yes, 600,
Yeah.
after
Okay.
605 million years ago, after the big global glaciations and all of that. And this has been a really big controversy. And the question then is, if this is life, why is it that it is only occurring in this environment? There are other debates around it. Why is it that we don't see it, across I mean the globe in other geological formations that deposited at that particular time? We don't see that. Now, um, if you look at the Ediacaran biota when they evolved, their evolution is tightly linked to this global snowball Earth glaciation that we had, meaning the Earth was covered with snow from pole to pole. So all the tropical seas, they had kilometer thick ice sheets on them. And when that glaciation basically eventually went away, when the ice melted, what happened was that the ice that was on the continents bulldozed the continents, crushed everything up and dumped a lot of nutrients into the ocean, bringing in a lot of phosphorus. And that phosphorus then, triggered uh, uh, the rise of complex life because suddenly there was food and resources to actually experiment with this type of thing. Now, when we go back to 2.1 billion years
Yeah.
ago in Franceville, the question is, if we're saying these things are complex organisms, how did they evolve? Where did the nutrients come from? And so we went back and looked in a sedimentary rock just beneath this layer where we have the fossils. We characterize that environment using all sorts of geochemical tools. And we realized that there was a lot of iron and manganese that was released into the ocean at that time. And that iron and manganese, we can clearly see the signatures reconstructing hydrothermal processes in deep time using geochemical parameters. We can clearly see that this iron and manganese was deposited by a submarine volcanic activity. But what is also intriguing is that we see in this iron a substantial amount of phosphorus. And
Yeah.
when we measure that phosphorus, it is almost the same level as that which we see in the Ediacaran just before the appearance of this complex organisms. So the hypothesis we have for where this phosphorus came from was that there was a continental, because we can see that there was weathering occurring,
Yeah.
erosion and weathering that released a lot of phosphorus into the marine basin over an extended period. But when the hydrothermal activity or the submarine volcanic activity occurred, and it occurred because two continents collided, and one was pushed underneath the other one, and then this led to volcanic activity. And that volcanic activity brought in a lot of reduced fluids, meaning very poor in oxygen, low oxygen concentration fluids, and that removed the oxygen from the basin. And because there was no oxygen now, the phosphorus that was on the sea floor, that phosphorus got released into seawater. A lot of it got released into seawater. And because of so much of that phosphorus being released into seawater, now there's a lot of nutrients, not just phosphorus, we see other nutrients. There's a lot of nutrients for these organisms to do exactly what they did during the Ediacaran period. But what we see at this scale is that this ocean was an intercontinental ocean. It was locked within the continent, just like the Red Sea. So there was no connection to the wider oceans. And this is a very, very restricted biological phenomenon. It wasn't a global thing. And that is why those organisms that we see there, um, they eventually went extinct because over time we see that another episode of volcanic activity, we think this is sub-area, occurred and deoxygenated that basin again. And so these organisms got extinct. And now what that is telling us is that the evolution of complex life probably has occurred at least two times in Earth history. One in a very narrow, small basin. We're saying a small basin, but this is a very large area, like the Red Sea. But in terms of the size of the Earth, it was a very restricted thing. And this is the point that we're trying to make here. And what it's even more interesting is that it, you know, hits or it stresses the fact that you need to have a lot of phosphorus
Hmm.
for complex life to evolve. We've seen it twice.
Bioavailable
Yes,
phosphorus, right?
phosphorus.
So you see another paper, Ernest, so transient fertilization of the post-Tertian snowball ocean margin with dissolved phosphate by clay minerals.
Yes,
So I want to understand the timeline here. So you say here marine sedimentary rocks deposited across the Neoproterozoic cryogenian snowball interval, 720 to 635 million years ago, suggests that post-snowball fertilization of shallow continental margin seawater with phosphorus accelerated marine primary productivity. And so the snowball effect is 720 to 635 million years ago, you say here. The 2.1 billion years ago phenomenon is not connected with this, the snowball effect, right? It's something different.
no, it's snowball. So the connection between phosphorus and primary production that we see in these two different time intervals, the connection is it's basically phosphorus and the fact that at any time that we've seen this large input of bioavailable phosphorus in the ocean,
Mm.
it's been related to some catastrophic event, right? So in the case of 2.1 billion years ago, it was a catastrophic volcanic activity that happened because two continents collided.
I see. Okay.
Now,
Yeah.
in the case of the snowball event, it was the cooling of the Earth that basically kept the Earth frigid, I think, for about 15 million years,
Mm.
and it's in forming this really thick ice sheets. And
Yeah.
when they melted, now they bulldozed the continent and released a lot of phosphorus
Mm.
into the ocean. So they're very distinct event, but connected by, catastrophic circumstances
Lot of phosphorus.
and a
Yeah.
lot of
So
phosphorus.
yeah. So sorry to interrupt. So, but it's going through my mind, Ernest. I don't know. So two distinct times you say life might have started. Um,
Complex life,
Complex
not
life. Yeah.
microbial life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not possible now, right? So is it possible that new life can start? If it started twice before.
Yeah, well, to start again, then we need to basically eradicate the present complex life, right? Something
Okay.
something has to happen that basically remove, complex anything that's going to basically reproduce and give rise to complex life. We need to disrupt that.
Yeah.
Then the process has to start again from microbial communities, and then evolving into more complex cells, and then complex cells coming together to form, you know, you know, tissues, organs, and all of this. And those organs they specialize into performing different functions, and then leading to animals and so on. So we will need to basically stop the current process,
Mhm.
which
So
is
the
which is
existing life acts as a constraint on possible new formation of life. Um, so going back to sort of connecting these two papers again, um, 2100 years ago, those researchers found something that looks like complex life 2100 million, 2.11 billion years ago.
yeah.
And we know that the Ediacaran period, I don't know, 720 to 635 or something, or 635 to 540 or something like that, million years ago, um, we had a huge set of complex life, right? Um, and then they went extinct, and then we started again. So did we do this three times at least
Yeah,
so
yeah.
far?
So that's an interesting question, isn't it? So you have the Ediacaran biota. Now, when you look at these organisms, you can tell that they were soft bodied individuals, and all they did was just lie around, lazy around. They didn't, nothing threatened them. They were not, food was there. They just, and what we see when we transition from those organisms, when we start to see the kind of aggressive biosphere that we have today,
Hmm.
is that we see suddenly creatures start to appear that have horns on their bodies, they have fangs, teeth, they're predators.
Hmm.
So what we think is that, as this community was evolving, suddenly there might have become competition, and they started evolving in such a way that individuals came that could actually outcompete them. And we think that these predators basically wiped out these individuals, basically. So it's a continuous timeline.
Mm.
Unlike in 2.1 billion years ago, there's no continuous timeline because that biota got extinct completely because we don't see anything from there until the Ediacaran period.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the Ediacaran period, we believe, we originate from those Ediacaran animals that were just lying around on the seafloor doing nothing, really.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, do we sort of look at this as two phases with some sort of missing link between them, or as you say, it's a continuous process? Do we have, I mean, it's very, very difficult to get the fossil story right based on the data that we have. But do we have evidence that they sort of moved into the modern animals, let me call it that way?
Yeah, so one of the things with working with fossils is that it's very difficult to reconstruct genetic processes because these are just mineralized or structures that are minerals that have been all the biological material has been replaced by minerals and preserved, the
Mm,
morphology preserved, and sometimes you can even see the anatomy and all of that well preserved, but you do not have the genetic signal to actually reconstruct the history.
yeah.
We build the phylogenetic trees, the trees of life that we build today. I mean, all I need to do is to sequence my DNA, and I'll be able to, to make a lot of genetic connections. I might be related to you, don't know. Yeah, I mean, obviously we are because we come from that one genetic pool, going very way back in time. But there's no way to actually link this genetically to those organisms because we don't have the genetic material. But what we can tell from the geochemical and geological interpretations is that
Yeah.
we see a shift from a community of individuals that were quite vulnerable. They didn't have any defense systems
Mm,
into communities that are quite predatory.
mm.
And we know that in a modern environment, if you put the sort of organisms with predators are going to wipe them out completely.
And they couldn't move, right? Ediacaran.
No, there was just most of them were just lying around there. And again, the rock record is not interrupted. So we can see a gradual transition from these individuals to now, or I don't know if it's gradual, but we can see that transition from these
Mm,
individuals to this very, very, very aggressive form of life that, extends up to this day. We really think that competition and
mm.
predation was actually what wiped out the Ediacaran biota.
And the Ediacaran entities, were they DNA based, or do we know?
Well, if we are going by what we know about life, and this individuals, had, the typical characteristics of animals, the bilateral. They had symmetry, they had, the things that we can tell. It would mean that they had to transfer genetic information in some way,
Mm.
and that would mean DNA. They had DNA, but that DNA, as I said previously, is no longer there because all we have now are the mineralized um, forms in a geological record. We don't have the DNA.
Yeah, I was looking at something, Ernest. I don't know if I quite understand this. So, you know, uh, people were asking, are these plants or are these animals? Um, and they look more like animals, but then the way that they get the nutrient is by absorption, by some sort of osmosis process. I don't know what the process they might have used, but not like what animals do. But it's unlike plants. So it is, some ways it's a different thing altogether, right? We don't currently have.
Yeah, so that again points to how primitive these individuals were and shows that stepwise evolution from a process that is not very effective. This is what evolution has showed, has demonstrated that over time, life has perfected itself to actually be able to make the maximum use of the resources around itself using the least amount of energy. So you have these individuals that were lying around with poor defense mechanism, probably lying on the same spot is not even advantageous comparatively to someone that can move around and actually find new food sources and so on. So yes, so they were primitive. They used primitive means to actually acquire their food, and there's still some primitive individuals I mean around today that use this type of systems to actually feed themselves. Some engulf things like amoeba, just engulf the food and then secrete some enzymes in it that digest the food for them to then assimilate. So some of these primitive processes are still in place, and what you always see is that those primitive processes are also linked to very primitive individuals in terms of evolution, biological
Yeah.
evolution. Yeah.
It's um, it's really interesting. So it almost seems to me that the Aquarian entities did all the heavy lifting for life. They were alive. Their environment was sort of adaptive, or they were adaptive to the environment, I should say, before the predators, as you say, showed up and possibly got wiped out, right? Something along those lines.
Yes, somebody in that community suddenly found a way to maximize, the resources available and started transforming into a more aggressive individual that then led to this population that exploded. And this is really in line with the concept of biological evolution, where we don't know what the triggers could have been. It
Mm,
might be certain triggers in the environment that then led to this new type of lifestyle that then eradicated these individuals. But they are they are the key cornerstone
mm,
organisms when it comes to the transition from a mainly microbial world to
yeah.
the modern biosphere that's so diverse with all sorts of animals, to the dinosaurs and all of that. Then us with our big brains, and so they're very, very central to our understanding of biological I mean evolution through time.
Mm. So in the second paper, you say here we demonstrate a causal relationship between clay mineral production by the melting Sturgeon snowball ice sheets and a short-lived increase in seawater phosphate bioavailability by at least 20-fold, and oxygenation of an immediate post-Sturgeon snowball ocean margin. So could we simulate this? I mean, could we pump a lot of phosphorus into an environment and see if things happen?
I'll
I'm
tell
just
you what,
speculating.
if you pump a lot of phosphorus in a modern environment, the difference is that you already have life existing there.
Yeah.
That life is going to flourish. And this is what is happening with eutrophication. So when we release sewage into coastal environments, what
Mm.
happens is that because life is already there, that
Yeah.
life, it's, anything that's trying to develop is not going to be able to compete with this life that's already developed the mechanism to use that energy or
Yeah.
that resource and multiply and take over. So when we release a lot of phosphorus, just like nitrogen into the environment, what we
Mm.
do is that, for example, cyanobacteria, algae, they just take over, and that's why
Yeah.
you find this green slime on lakes that are receiving a lot of sewage or contaminated
Mm.
water that's contaminated with phosphorus and so on and so forth. So no, I think the problem here is that we already have too many smart individuals existing that they're not going to allow anything else they're going to outcompete anything else that is still trying
Mm.
to evolve.
So that's interesting. So that is sort of, let me speculate, and you can correct me. There's implications for life elsewhere too, which means that once life starts, and starts to dominate, nothing else can be there because it's a competition. And so if you go to another planet and we find life, you would imagine, even if you find variety in body shapes and all of that, you would imagine all of them are closely related, right? Is that what our conjecture would be?
You would, so you're saying that if you find life somewhere and there's competition, all of that stuff, what you would infer is that they are likely closely related. Yes, I would think so. There is a great uh, meaning in living as a collective.
Mm,
You gain protection, you gain different individuals in a community. They undertake different duties. So, for example, in environment, the cyanobacteria takes the energy from sunlight, splits
mm,
water, take electrons out of the water, reduces CO2, and produce all the organic matter that is required to produce all the proteins, the lipids, and all of that, right? And then
mm.
they release oxygen as a waste product. And me and
Yeah.
you, we are breathing that oxygen. That's why we say this is the waste product of photosynthetic organisms. So you would imagine that this is a community of individuals that have evolved to undertake different functions in in the environment. And
Mm,
what is limiting them now becomes the resources that they have at their disposal, really.
mm,
And that would control how big or how small that population is over time. I would find it really difficult to think that if you go out there and you find a community of living individuals, they have completely different origins. I would think that
mm,
usually the most dominant or most successful individuals will eventually take over and then evolve into different forms. It may be that even on Earth, the early life that we
mm.
see today, there were different forms that evolved, but what is left now, these are the forms that were the most they were more competitive than those that got extinct, and that's what we're saying.
Yeah, so it's a community that's surviving, that's evolving. So do we have a way to sort of see what is sort of the minimum scale that is needed to sustain an organism? It's not going to sustain by itself. It needs to have a community of things right around it.
Um, so I would simply say that when we look at the modern biosphere, the smallest scale we see individuals in, that's the micro scale where you have microorganisms. I mean, you take a grain of soil, you have millions and millions of bacteria, different
Mm,
bacteria doing different things, living in that grain of soil, a teaspoonful of soil. This is, you can have billions of bacteria and microorganisms living in there. So that
yeah.
that the scale, it scales up. It goes from that micro level and then to this level that we have today. And in our bodies, the micro scale, we have more bacteria in our bodies than we have human cells, and there's a symbiotic relationship between
Mm.
us and those organisms that live in us. Without them, we'd be dead. And without us, they will not exist. So you can look at that range
Mm.
in that way and how organisms actually work together to sustain each other.
Excellent. Yeah, I know that I have to let you go, Ernest. So, yeah, this has been really instructive. Thanks for spending time with me.
Thanks for having me. It's we've been trying to get this going for a while now. Finally, we found time to do this. I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.